Does this situation sound familiar? All of your points are perfect in your quilt top, and you've chosen a design to quilt it with that's just so excellent. It's complimentary, you're just so pleased with it, but now it's time to bind. And in previous quilts, you've had a little trouble with some wobbles and weaves. Well, today's your show then. Taya Urich is here, and she's going to tell us how to get perfect bindings every time. So stay with us for Quilter's Tea. Welcome back to the Quilter's Tea. I'm Jody Davis. Today's show is all about bindings. Taya Urich is here. She's the author of the Binding Gizmo and the creator of the gizmo itself. She's going to show us how to make our bindings perfect every time. Welcome to the show, Taya.
Thanks, Jody.
Tell me what made you make this book?
We have a shop on the east side of Portland, and I've been quilting for over 15 years and teaching for as long. And the number one question that we always get is, after spending hours making your quilt top, could you just show me real quick how to do the binding?
Real quick, huh?
Real quick.
All right.
Exactly. So it's not a real quick process. We've seen lots of helpful tips and hints in other books, but no ultimate reference guide for how to make and put on and connect the binding strips on each and every quilt.
So you did it.
That's how the book got started, and the tool makes putting the ends together on your quilt a snap.
So you're going to show us that today.
I am going to show you how to do all of that today.
Okay, great. Let's get started.
Okay. The first thing that you want to do when you work on a quilt is understand that it's not finished until you make your binding strips. These are binding strips, and in the last few weeks I've been cleaning out my sewing room.
Yes.
And found 2 projects from 6 years ago that were unfinished. I know all of us have projects like that. But the worst part about it is that I've used the fabric that was designated for the binding in other projects.
Oh, you throw it back in your stash.
I do.
Oh,
I do.
no.
So one of the first things you want to do always is make your binding up and put it in a roll like this.
Or on a toilet paper roll.
Great way to recycle those toilet paper cores that you don't know what to do with. And it's all about recycling, isn't it? So this is a really good way to store your fabrics. It also tells you how many unfinished projects you have.
Oh,
Just
that's
a little
true.
reminder.
That's true. Oh, maybe we don't want to know.
Well, we'll put these aside for right now
Okay.
because we'll use those later. And after you have made your binding strips, then the question is, how do you put them on? But there are a couple of ways that you can actually make the binding strips. Either straight binding, which is what we're all used to, where you cut it from selvage to selvage, and they're
On
just
a straight of grain.
Exactly. On the straight of grain, you just put them together end to end. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the other option is to use a striped fabric and cut it on the bias. And we're going to talk about that. A perfect example of that is right behind us on both of these quilts. Their stripe binding on this one shows a contrast and is a really nice way to complement the quilt. And on this one, with the scalloped edges, is a great way to keep the binding loose and movie so that you can get in and out of those crevices.
The bias provides some give so that it'll bend around those pretty scallops.
Exactly.
And also cutting the stripes on the bias makes them on the diagonal around the quilt. It would be it
Looks
would
like
just
a
not
rope
be
then.
as good if those weren't on the diagonal.
Yes, it gives it a little accent. So let me show you first how to cut bias binding. We've already talked about how to cut straight of grain. And what we're going to do, we're used to, in a lot of the books, they tell you to take a square and cut it on the diagonal, and then you have to stand on your head and put them back together and
There
draw
was this
lines.
folding thing.
Yes,
and
very
all that,
complicated. An easier way to do it is with yardage. You can take a 1/2 yard cut, a 3/4 yard cut, a 1 yard cut, whatever you have that's your striped fabric. And you're actually going to open it up so that your selvages are on the right and left side.
Okay.
You're going to take the bottom corner and fold it up like so. And then you're going to take the upper corner and fold it down.
Okay.
So that we now have a flat piece of fabric that has a fold on it. Now, if, for example, you're making 2.5-inch binding strips, your first cut, because it's on the fold, is going to be at 1.25 inches.
Okay.
So we're going to make that cut right now. And we do that with just a straight ruler. And because we've got it folded down, the entire ruler fits on the fold. And we're going to cut 1.25 inches. I always double cut to make sure. and this is our first strip. So here it is. The stripe now is at a 45-degree angle.
Yes.
The other thing that you'll notice about it is that the end is at a 45-degree angle.
Oh, you don't have to recut them.
Exactly. You'll see why in just a second, why that's important. Now your second cut on over is going to be at 2.5 inches.
Right, the full width, because
full
you're not on the fold anymore.
Exactly. And what happens is we now get 2 strips for every cut. You'll notice that the triangle moves up as we go, and so all you do is grab it and pull it down, and your ruler will continue to stay right on that edge.
That's much easier.
Much easier.
Much easier.
You can use the whole width. The other thing about cutting your strips this way, if you use a full yard cut and fold it like this, you get 50-inch binding strips without a seam.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
So the fewer seams you can have in a bias,
The better.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so let's now talk about how to put our binding strips together. And this is where the gizmo comes in really handy.
Okay.
I'm just going to lay this out so that we can see how it works. One of the areas that people have trouble, quilters have trouble, is in remembering how to put the seams together and sew them the right way. There are any number of times that I've had to take the seams out because I sewed it the wrong direction.
These are when you're joining the two ends, your beginning and your
Yes.
ending end of the binding.
Yes, and when you make all of your strips, it's much easier to just sew them together all at the same time instead of sewing, pinning, sewing, pinning.
Yes.
So we're going to show how to do that today.
Okay.
If you're using a straight cut 2.5-inch piece, you would put one on that side and you would match the other one. This shows you binding face up and binding face down.
Tells you exactly how to lay them out.
Exactly. It shows just like that. And what you'll notice, a lot of times when you go to sew a diagonal seam, it's easier if you keep the edges off, because then you actually have a mark to sew to.
Oh, a starting point and an ending point for your seam.
If you match these corners exactly on the point on both sides, you
wouldn't
can't see it.
You wouldn't see where to
Right.
go.
You can't
Where do
see
I
it as
start?
much.
Where do I end?
The bigger question is, where do you end exactly? So by overlapping them, which is what we show here on the gizmo, by overlapping them, you have a better chance of hitting those two corners. And that's what we're going to have you do. I've already pre-pinned these. Now when you go to pin them, you've already laid them out the way it shows on the gizmo. Now it shows you here to sew from corner to corner. Where I've had a problem before is I've sewn from the wrong corner to the wrong corner.
Oh no, and then you get this thing that goes the wrong way.
It doesn't work. So this way you're assured that it will work. If you put your gizmo on a flat surface like this and just line up all of your strips end to end and pin them, I take a pin and I pin it the direction that I'm sewing. That way I never have a question about which way that seam is going to go. All right? So now you can put this in your sewing machine, and I'm going to have you sew these together.
I can do that. We are using some colored threads so that everyone can see what we're doing. Got it. There we go. And we would just chain piece these?
Yes,
we are.
you would.
We have
Don't
more
even
ready
take it
for
out of your machine.
Okay.
And I've already pinned those together for you. The less you have to take it in and out of your machine, the more you can concentrate on just doing that process over and over again well.
Right, right. The fewer things you have to think about.
Yes.
Yep.
And I spend more time doing than thinking, and that seems to work well.
Yes, with fewer mistakes that way.
Very good.
There we go.
Now you can take it out of your machine. We're going to cut in the threads in between. This next part is very important. As quilters, we learn that when we make a seam, what size seam allowance do we use?
1/4 inch.
1/4 inch. When you're doing binding, and then what do we do with that seam when we're finished with it?
Press it to one side.
Exactly. And with binding, you want to use a 1/2 inch seam, and you want to press it open. Now think about it. When you're doing your binding and you get to a seam, that's where it will have a tendency to bulk up. So
yes,
to get
you get the little blurps.
Exactly. Yeah, we call that the bowling ball in the snake. And we don't want any bowling balls on our quilt.
No.
So what you do...
Unless they're appliqued.
Exactly, on the outside. Right. And so what we want to do is we want to do a 1/2 inch seam and press it open, and that will spread the bulk over. A 1/2 inch seam will
that
press
makes
open
sense.
easier. The other thing about a 1/2 inch seam is that it's like a bad haircut. If it's too short, it won't lay flat. That's why you leave more fabric on the seam so that when you press it open, it will actually lay flat.
And then the stitching holds it down better, I would imagine.
Right. But you definitely want to go with a 1/2 inch seam. So I'm going to have you cut these real quick at a 1/2 inch. And we can just use the gizmo. Believe it or not, this is a 1/2 inch from the edge. And so the line on the edge where you used it for the binding strips will also provide a reference for you when you cut these 1/2 inch seams. So I'll just let you do.
That was smart thinking.
Well, we're trying to make it as useful as possible.
An all-in-one tool.
Yes.
There we go. And one more.
Yes. One lesson that we can all learn is to remember to change our blades on a regular basis so that we're not working with dull tools.
That's right.
Very good. And if you just want to take that over,
Sure. To
the next step. The next step is to press those seams open.
There we go, which is a little different.
Yes. It's not what we're used to. And again, that's why the binding will work better, because you're learning some techniques that are going to make it do what binding is supposed to. Binding is supposed to be invisible. Unless you're doing a high contrast on purpose, your binding typically matches your border fabric, and good binding is binding that you don't see. You want your focus to be on the quilt.
Okay, so if it's done neatly, you don't call attention to it.
Exactly. Okay.
There we are.
And then you would go ahead, the next step would be to just go ahead and press these in half.
Okay.
And we have some finished ones here that we're going to use, but you would press these in half, wrong sides together, and then put it into what I call a cinnamon roll, and put it away until you're ready to put it on your quilt. Okay, so now the next step is, how do you attach your binding to your project? I'm going to flip this over just so that you can see this is a finished project. My suggestion is that if you are just learning how to do binding, do placemats, because they're small and manageable, and you can practice without making any mistakes on your quilt.
And you're finished, would have something finished at the end.
Yes.
Rather than something you're just storing away.
Right. It's kind of like learning how to drive a car. You would not get into a race car and go on the driving track before you learned before you learned how to turn the engine on. So this is a small, manageable, and doable project, and not so big that you're trying to manage the fabric, the size of the quilt, along with learning a new process. So my suggestion is you do something small. We're going to finish one just about this size. And I've set it up here. This is the front of the quilt and the back. And remember that before you put your binding on, whether you're quilting it yourself or getting it back from a quilter who has put it on a long arm machine, you need to square up your quilt.
Yes.
And that's shown in the book at the beginning. It's
How to do that.
How to do that. It's one of the key points that keeps a quilt, the binding on a quilt, looking good. If it's wavy before you put the binding on, trust me, it's going to be wavier when it's done.
The binding won't fix it.
No, the binding won't fix it. Very good
Accentuate
point.
it.
Exactly. Okay, so here is our quilt, our little placemat, and I'm going to grab some very high contrast fabric, and hopefully this won't hurt your eyes as you're sewing on it.
Not at all.
What we want to do is we want to match the raw edges of the quilt with the raw edge of your binding. And you'll notice on the gizmo that it tells you, there's a very solid line up here, and it tells you to put the clean cut beginning edge of your double fold binding on this line. So we've matched it up there. And then I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to, in the groove, this binding is 2.5 inches. In the groove that's marked 2.5 inches, we're actually going to mark a line.